Big Shaq's son walked into the boardroom with a vision to own, but the bank laughed, not knowing who raised him. They thought wealth without legacy meant weakness. Then Big Shaq arrived, not to rescue, but to remind the system what happens when you mock the bloodline of a giant. The boardroom would never laugh the same way again. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was supposed to be a simple meeting, but the laughter cut sharper than a knife. The bank's glass tower caught the mid-morning sun like a mirror, casting blinding shards of light onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. Darius O'Neal adjusted his navy blazer and stepped through the revolving doors. He'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. Every line, every pause, every counter-argument. His documents were precise, his pitch tight. This was legacy work. He wasn't just trying to own a bank. He was trying to rewrite what people like him were told they couldn't be. Inside, everything smelled like polished marble and controlled air. The elevator hummed its way to the 47th floor, where the conference room waited. The receptionist, a pale, tight-lipped woman who didn't bother to look up when he gave his name, buzzed him through. The boardroom looked like a scene out of a corporate movie. Long walnut table, panoramic skyline views, leather chairs already filled. 11 board members, all white, all male, except for one woman who didn't smile when Darius entered. He smiled anyway. "Good morning, thank you for seeing me." The chairman, Reginald Barr, gave a curt nod. "Let's keep this brief, Mr. O'Neal. You've requested a presentation slot. You have 15 minutes. Darius unpacked his proposal with steady hands. He walked them through a detailed offer, an acquisition of 51% shares in their bank, using a combination of liquid capital, strategic partnerships, and community reinvestment incentives. Every number was sound, every projection bulletproof. But the air in the room didn't shift. Nobody took notes. He finished, silence falling like a curtain. One board member, Franklin Holt, leaned back, smirking. "You're serious about this?" Darius nodded. "Completely." Another chuckled, a sharp scoff echoing across the table. "This is ambitious and cute. But let's be honest, son. This isn't a game of Monopoly." Darius felt the sting. "I'm not playing." Reginald folded his hands. "Let me be frank. We don't doubt your enthusiasm. But banking's about credibility, networks, history, and quite frankly, your resume isn't seasoned enough. Wealth doesn't always equal influence, Mr. O'Neal." There was a pause, pregnant with meaning. Then someone added under his breath, "Besides, we're not in the business of handing over power just because someone's daddy's rich." The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Darius swallowed hard, every instinct telling him to speak, to push back, but something else told him to walk out with his pride. He gathered his folder, nodded politely, and turned to leave. Just before he stepped out, Franklin called after him. "Tell your father we love him on TNT, though. Always entertaining." The door clicked shut behind him. The hallway outside was quiet, but Darius could still hear the laughter. He rode the elevator down with his fists clenched inside his pockets. He kept his head high as he walked out into the sun, but every step felt heavier than the last. He'd played by the rules, brought solutions, not complaints, wore the suit, bit his tongue. Still, none of it had been enough. Across the street, unnoticed by Darius, a woman leaned against a black sedan, watching. She wore dark glasses and a sharp suit, but her posture was relaxed, practiced. She had seen this story play out before too many times, but this one was different. This one had that name. She lifted her phone, typed a quick note. They laughed at Darius O'Neal, full board present. All white, tape rolling. Inside the building, the board laughed louder, but outside the wind had shifted. Darius walked 4 blocks in silence before ducking into a diner. He ordered coffee, didn't touch it, and stared blankly at the napkin dispenser. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. How'd it go? He stared at the screen, typing nothing. What could he say? That they didn't even pretend to respect him? That the color of his skin outshouted every number in his portfolio? He shoved the phone back in his pocket. The waitress brought his check even though he hadn't touched the coffee. "You all right, honey?" she asked gently. Darius looked up at her. She was middle-aged, black, eyes warm and knowing. He gave a thin smile. "Just tired of being underestimated." She nodded like she understood. "You ain't the first." but I bet you'll be the last one they laugh at. Outside, the black sedan pulled into traffic. The woman in the suit made another call, this one to an unlisted number. It happened, she said, exactly like we thought. The voice on the other end was low, composed. You okay? She paused. Pride took a hit. But the kids got fire. Good, the voice replied. Let them laugh. She smiled. You want me to call Lucille? No, I'll handle it.
The call ended.
Miles away, in a quiet estate just outside of Atlanta, Shaquille O'Neal stood on his back porch with a basketball resting under his palm. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and let out a deep breath. The sun had shifted in the sky. A shadow crossed his face. He hadn't wanted to interfere. He'd raised Darius to stand tall, to fight clean, to earn his way without leaning on his father's name. But today's news, it lit a different fire. They didn't just reject his son's business. They mocked his name, and that was going to cost them. The afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of Shaquille O'Neal's private home gym in Orlando, glinting off the polished hardwood floors. Shaq stood still, one hand resting on a basketball, the other gripping his phone tightly. He hadn't gotten the call from Darius, not yet, but the whispers had already reached him through his vast network. Former business partners, sponsors, agents, media contacts. The words kept circling. They laughed at him, laughed in his face. Shaq's chest tightened as he paced slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows on the wall. He had wanted Darius to climb the ladder himself, to fight his own battles, make his own mark. For years, Shaq had stepped back, resisting every urge to pull strings or wave his name like a magic wand. But this was different. This wasn't just business rejection. It reeked of something old, something bitter. He could hear it in the tone people used when they recounted the meeting, the casual dismissal, the undertone of racism, the sneers they thought were hidden behind closed doors. In the corner of the room, Jenna, his longtime assistant, hovered by the door, uncertain. Shaq, the media's sniffing already. They're asking if you'll comment. Want me to draft a statement? Shaq shook his head, his deep voice rumbling. Not yet. Jenna hesitated. They're saying the board laughed. Shaq turned, his face carved in stone. They laughed at you? He whispered, almost to himself. A storm brewed behind his usually easygoing eyes. A quiet rage that had nothing to do with celebrity pride. It was deeper than that. He remembered his own early years in the business world. The way white executives smiled to his face, then mocked him behind his back, dismissing him as just an athlete, a fleeting brand. He remembered the subtle slights, the patronizing deals, the times they shook his hand but not his partner's. He had endured it, he had buried it, but now they were doing it to his son. Across the country, Darius sat in his high-rise apartment, shoulders slumped, eyes staring blankly at the city lights. His phone buzzed on the table, his father's name lighting up the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. He felt small, embarrassed. He hadn't wanted his father involved, hadn't wanted the world to see him stumble. But the boardroom scene played over and over in his mind. Every laugh, every sneer. He had walked out with his head high, but inside the cracks were deepening. Back in Orlando, Shaq took a long breath, walking over to the window. The backyard stretched out in serene perfection. But inside him, nothing was calm. His mother, Lucille, called just then, her voice sharp with intuition. I heard, she said simply. Shaq closed his eyes, the weight of family generations pressing on his chest. Mama, I'm trying to let him handle it. Lucille didn't hesitate. Shaquille, there's a difference between letting a man stand and letting him drown. You know what they did in that room. Don't pretend you don't. Shaq rubbed his face roughly. He could hear Darius's voice from years ago, a determined little boy saying, I'll make you proud, Daddy. He had made him proud, but this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about power, about the kind of invisible chains they had worked so hard to break, only to find them reforged in new shapes. Later that evening, Shaq sat in his study, scrolling through the reports Jenna had gathered. The bank's board members, their backgrounds, their public statements, their past deals. Patterns emerged, familiar ones, institutions that smiled at black money but locked the doors when black hands reached for real control. He thought of Darius, of all the work he had put in, all the clean deals, the solid strategies, only to be laughed out of the room because his face, his skin, his family name didn't fit the mold. Shawnee Henderson, Shaq's ex-wife, called just as he was deep in thought. Her voice was careful but edged. Shaq, don't bulldoze this. You know how you get. Darius needs space. I know, Shaq said softly. I can't let them do this. He has to want your help, Shawnee warned. You can't storm in and fix it for him. He'll never forgive you. Shaq sat in silence, the quiet hum of the house surrounding him. He had always been larger than life, always the one to sweep in, to fix, to dominate. But this fight wasn't about fame or strength. It was about letting Darius decide what kind of man he wanted to be, and standing ready when the time came. Meanwhile, unknown to either father or son, Jordan West was moving. In her small apartment, she pieced together internal documents, emails, and board meeting notes she had quietly collected over the past year. The bank had a pattern, one no one dared speak of out loud. But if she played this right, if she reached out to the right people, she could tip the balance. She hesitated, hovering over Darius's contact. She knew he had no idea who she was. But sometimes, change needed a spark from the most unexpected places. Back in Orlando, Shaq stood on the balcony, looking up at the stars. He had fought countless battles in his life, on and off the court. But this one felt different. This one wasn't his to win, it was his to back. Quietly, strategically, without crushing his son's spirit, he reached for his phone and typed a message to Jenna. Start digging. Quietly. I need to know everything about that board, every weak point. Then he sent one more text. To Darius. Proud of you, son. Always. Call me when you're ready. He hesitated, then hit send. The night deepened. Somewhere in New York, Darius stared at his phone, the message glowing on the screen, hands trembling slightly. He didn't know yet what his father was planning, didn't know how many pieces were already moving beneath the surface. But the game had changed. And soon, the ones who laughed would find the joke turning back on them. The late evening light slanted across Lucille O'Neal's spacious Florida kitchen, casting long shadows on the polished granite countertops. Shaq sat at the head of the table, his massive hands folded tightly, eyes focused, jaw clenched. Across from him, Lucille, his mother, and Shawnee Henderson, his ex-wife, sat close together, their voices sharp with concern. It wasn't the first time they'd pulled together like this, an uneasy alliance forged when family matters became too big for one person to carry. Lucille leaned forward, her silver earrings catching the light. Shaquille, I know that look. Don't you dare. Her voice had the steady command of a woman who'd raised him through storms far worse than this. You need to slow down before you go storming in. Shawnee crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on Shaq's face. Darius didn't even tell you himself. He's a grown man, Shaq. You can't keep running in and fixing things for him. Shaq's gaze flicked from one woman to the other. His chest rose and fell slowly, but the simmering heat under his calm was unmistakable. They humiliated him, he said, voice low but tight. They didn't just reject the deal. They laughed. In his face, you think I'm supposed to sit here and let that happen? Lucille shook her head, her voice softening but no less firm. You raised him to stand tall, son. You told him to fight his own battles. Now you want to strip that away because you can't stand seeing him hurt. She leaned back, her hands pressing against the table as if steadying herself. I remember when you were his age. I remember you coming home after your first sponsorship rejection, swearing you'd show them all. And you did, on your own terms. Shawnee's voice cut in gently. Darius has always felt like he had to prove himself without you. You come crashing into this, Shaq, and you'll take that away from him. He'll never trust you in business again. For a moment the room filled with silence, only the faint ticking of the wall clock breaking the stillness. Shaq pushed back slightly, his massive shoulders tensing. I don't want to control him, he murmured, almost to himself. But I can't let this pass. This isn't just a business loss. It's a message, one they've been sending to men like me, like him for decades. Stay in your lane. Smile, entertain, spend, but don't dare own. Lucille's eyes softened, but she didn't relent. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't watched you fight that same fight all your life? But baby, sometimes stepping in isn't helping. Sometimes, it's making the fight even heavier for the one carrying it. She reached across, her hands small against his. Darius is hurting, yes, but part of him needs to rise on his own. You stepping in now, are you doing it for him? Or because you can't bear sitting on the sidelines? Shaq's mouth pressed into a hard line. He hated how well they knew him. Hated how right they were. But deep down, the decision had already crystallized inside him. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about justice. About dismantling a system that smirked and dismissed black ambition no matter how dressed up or well-funded it came. Shawnee watched him closely, her expression tightening. If you do this, do it with your eyes open, Shaq. Don't bulldoze in. Don't make it about flexing power. Make it about clearing a path for Darius to lead. Because if you make this your fight, he'll always be your shadow. For a long stretch, no one spoke. Shaq's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers slowly uncurling. He could still see Darius as a boy, chasing basketballs across the driveway, determined to outshoot his father, always striving, always pushing. That fire was still there, but now it was singed with the sting of rejection, public humiliation, and a deep festering injustice. He stood, pushing back from the table, with a slow, controlled motion. I hear you. I do, he rumbled softly. But I'm not walking into this to take over. I'm walking in to hold the door open, so when Darius steps through, no one dares slam it in his face again. Lucille rose, her back straight, her voice low. Just remember, son, you're not just fighting for him. You're fighting for every black boy who watches him. Every family that sees what happens when one of us tries to own. Not just perform. You fight smart. You fight clean. And you let him stand at the front. Shawnee added carefully. He has to want you there, Shaq. You call him. You talk to him. No backroom deals. No surprise headlines. You show him you trust him to carry his part. Shaq gave a slow nod, the weight of their words anchoring deep inside him. I will, he promised quietly. But I'm not staying silent. As the night deepened, Shaq stepped outside onto the darkened patio. The stars stretched out in a velvet sky. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Darius's number. In the quiet, he thought about every door that had been slammed in his own face. Every laugh he'd swallowed. Every deal he'd had to pry open with sheer force. But Darius could walk through on different terms. If he could just hold the walls back long enough. He tapped out a short message. Son, I'm here. We fight smart, and we fight together. Call me. Behind him, Lucille watched from the kitchen window, her heart heavy but proud. Shawnee stood beside her, arms folded, face tense but resolute. The mothers knew the stakes. Not just for their son, not just for Darius, but for the story their whole family was stepping into. A story bigger than bank boardrooms or rejection letters. A story about breaking the old rules and making new ones. Inside, Shaq felt the shift, the quiet before the storm. And deep down, he knew, this time, the system wasn't ready for the O'Neals. The morning light poured over Manhattan as Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of the black SUV, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the bank's polished glass entrance. Dressed in an impeccably tailored gray suit, his face unreadable behind dark sunglasses, Shaq walked with the steady, unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly how much space he occupied. He had come alone, no entourage, no press. But the moment he entered the Crestmont Bank lobby, the atmosphere shifted. Staff who barely glanced up at anyone else froze mid-conversation. The receptionist's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the phone to alert the boardroom upstairs. Inside the executive suite, the board members sat relaxed, sipping coffee, reviewing market reports. Gregory Phelps, the smug chairman, glanced up with mild interest when his assistant whispered in his ear, then gave a short laugh. Shaquille O'Neal, really, is this take your father to work day? Sarah Whitmore smirked, flicking her perfectly polished nails against her coffee cup. Let's give him 5 minutes. A courtesy meeting. PR loves that stuff. But when Shaq entered the room, the smirks faltered. He didn't shake hands. He didn't sit until they offered a chair. And when he finally took his place at the table, he leaned forward, resting his enormous hands on the gleaming surface, and began to speak low, even, no theatrics. I understand you laughed at my son's proposal. The words weren't a question. Gregory chuckled, though the sound was thinner now. Mr. O'Neal, we appreciate celebrity interest in serious business. But you must understand. Shaq cut in smoothly. I understand more than you think. He slid a slim folder across the table. This is not a celebrity stunt. This is a formal presentation, backed by legal review, compliance audits, and a full analysis of your board's recent transactions. The room went quiet. One of the older board members frowned, glancing uneasily at the folder. Sarah laughed softly. Are you here to make an offer, Mr. O'Neal? Is this about buying your son a seat at the table? Shaq's eyes met hers, cool and steady. No. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a man used to commanding stadiums. I'm not here to buy your bank. I'm here to expose it. The words landed like a slap. For a long second, no one moved. Then Gregory leaned forward, his face hardening. Careful, Shaquille. That sounds dangerously close to defamation. Shaq gave a small, slow smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. Not if it's backed by evidence. He gestured casually toward the folder. Discriminatory lending patterns, unfair rejection rates, internal memos mocking minority clients. A pattern of dismissing qualified black investors, including my son. All of it gathered quietly, all of it now ready for public release. Sarah's smile slipped. You wouldn't dare. Shaq leaned back, folding his arms. Try me. Across the table, a younger board member, clearly nervous, glanced at the documents again. You can't prove intent. It's just business trends. Patterns. Shaq corrected smoothly. Patterns you've maintained across decades. Patterns Jordan West, yes, I know her name, helped uncover from inside. Patterns that, once public, will make every regulatory body and media outlet in the country come knocking. The boardroom air turned icy. Gregory's fingers drummed against the table, the confidence draining from his posture. What do you want, O'Neal? Shaq's face softened slightly, but his voice stayed firm. I want fairness. I want a system that doesn't laugh when my son walks in the room with solid business and gets dismissed because of who he is. I want your board to understand that celebrity isn't the shield here. It's the spotlight. You can push around quiet voices, but you can't hide from the loud ones. For a beat, no one spoke. Then Sarah leaned forward, her voice honeyed but strained. We could find a compromise. Shaq shook his head once. Not with me, with Darius. You're going to call him. You're going to apologize. You're going to reopen discussions, and you're going to do it because you know the alternative is your reputation being dragged across every headline in America. Gregory exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. You think you can muscle us into this? Shaq's smile was slow, measured. No, I'm not muscling anything. I'm just giving you a chance to fix what you broke before the world finds out how broken it really is. Across town, in his apartment, Darius paced anxiously, unaware of what was unfolding. He hadn't heard from his father all morning. Part of him was furious. Shaq might be stepping in, hijacking his fight. Another part, the part he hated admitting, desperately wanted his father's strength at his back. Inside the bank, the board huddled, voices low, tense, urgent. Shaq waited patiently, hands folded, calm as a man who had nothing left to prove. Finally, Gregory turned back, his smile brittle. We'll be in touch with Darius. Shaq rose, towering over them effortlessly. Good. He paused at the door, turning slightly. And one more thing, don't ever laugh at my family again. As he left, the air in the room stayed taut, the board members exchanging wide-eyed glances. The giant had walked in, but he hadn't come to play. Outside, Shaq stepped into the sunlight, exhaling slowly. He pulled out his phone, dialing Darius. When his son picked up, voice tense, Shaq's words were soft, but firm. It's your move now, son. I've cleared the table. Time for you to sit at the head of it. Inside the cold, glass-walled office of Crestmont Bank, Shaq's voice was calm, measured and steady, but Jordan West's heart pounded in her chest as she sat 2 floors below, headphones tucked under her sleek black bob. Listen, her small compliance cubicle was buried in the shadows of the towering skyscraper. But today she felt like the most dangerous person in the building. She hadn't planned to become a whistleblower. She hadn't planned to become anything but a quiet worker, a rule follower, someone who stayed under the radar. But there was only so long you could sit in silence while watching your own people shut out, dismissed, degraded. And today, her breaking point had arrived. She'd slipped the recording device into the boardroom under the guise of audio compliance checks, something the board members barely noticed anymore. But as she listened to Shaquille O'Neal lay out his case with quiet, lethal precision, she realized something electric was unfolding. This wasn't just a billionaire flexing his power. This was a father throwing a spotlight onto rot the world had politely ignored. She heard the tension crackle, heard the thinly veiled panic creep into the board's voices when Shaq revealed the evidence, the audits, the discrimination patterns they thought were buried deep. Jordan's fingers trembled slightly as she opened a new message draft on her laptop, attaching the audio file. She wasn't naive. She knew what leaking this meant. She knew it could cost her her job, maybe more, but she also knew the weight of the stories she'd heard over the past 2 years. Small black business owners denied loans, black entrepreneurs strung along in endless meetings, with no intention of ever letting them through the door. A culture of gatekeeping disguised as due diligence. She hit send, her breath catching as the email flew to a trusted journalist contact she'd quietly kept in her back pocket. Across town, Darius O'Neal sat in his apartment, hands running through his hair, eyes darting across the floor-to-ceiling windows as his phone buzzed. Another headline alert. Another news ping. His father's meeting at Crestmont was already making ripples. He felt it, the magnetic pull of Big Shaq's presence, the weight of the O'Neal name. Part of him was grateful, part of him burned with resentment. He had worked so hard to make his own name in business, so determined not to be Shaq's son but his own man. And now, here it was, unfolding without him. He slammed his fist lightly against the kitchen counter, frustration bubbling, just under the surface. His closest friend Corey called, but Darius let it ring out. What was he supposed to say? That his father had stormed into the bank without telling him. That the media was already running with a narrative that made him look like a sidelined son instead of the driving force behind the original bid. Darius clenched his jaw, pacing. He knew his father's heart, knew Shaq wasn't trying to steal the spotlight, but knowing didn't make it sting less. Meanwhile, at the bank, Jordan felt the ripple effect the moment her email hit the journalist's inbox. News vans were already gathering outside. Reporters were tweeting cryptic hints about a bombshell discrimination story involving Crestmont. She watched as upper-level managers rushed through the halls, voices tight, faces pale. She blended into the background, invisible as always, but this time she carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had finally pushed back. Upstairs, Shaq's phone buzzed. Jenna's message flashed across the screen. Media's picking up a leak. Did you authorize anything? Shaq's brow furrowed slightly, but he kept his focus on the board, whose members were now visibly rattled. The timing was unexpected, but Shaq wasn't one to waste a tactical advantage. He stood slowly, letting his massive frame dominate the room, his voice smooth but laced with steel. Gentlemen, you're about to have a very public conversation with the world. I suggest you make sure you're ready. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and left, leaving the board scrambling behind him. Outside, Jordan watched Shaq emerge from the building, her heart thudding in her chest. She knew she'd only set the first domino in motion. But it was enough. Enough to crack the surface. Enough to force a conversation no PR team could spin away. She quietly gathered her things, slipping out a side door, blending into the crowd. Her role was done for now. Darius finally answered his father's call late that night. The silence between them was heavy, taut with unsaid words. Dad, Darius began, his voice low, you didn't tell me you were going in. Shaq's voice was calm, steady. Didn't want to take it away from you, son. Just wanted to make sure the table was still there for you to sit at. Darius let out a slow breath, torn between gratitude and frustration. Now the media's going to paint this like you saved the day. I worked for this, Dad. Shaq's tone softened. I know, D. I know how hard you've worked. But sometimes you need both. The one kicking the door open and the one walking through it. This is your fight. I just made sure the crowd's watching. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Darius asked quietly, what happens next? Shaq smiled faintly. Next? You show them exactly why they should have never underestimated you. The next morning, the headlines broke like a thunderclap across every major news outlet. Billionaire Shaquille O'Neal confronts bank over racial bias. Within minutes, social media lit up. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. A storm of hashtags, retweets, videos, and memes. Clips of Shaq's towering figure striding into the bank's glass doors went viral. Split-screened alongside past clips of his NBA dominance, commentators calling it the boardroom dunk. Shaq's face was everywhere, and just behind it, Darius's name began trending as well. Inside the Crestmont Bank's PR war room, executives scrambled. Polished spokespeople prepped statements, carefully worded to deflect blame. Crestmont values diversity, no discrimination intended. Productive conversations with Mr. O'Neal's team. But outside those sleek press releases, the internet roared with a force they hadn't counted on. Influencers, activists, celebrities, everyday people flooded feeds with support for the O'Neals, tagging the bank, demanding accountability, sharing personal stories of discrimination. The PR machine was slick, but the truth had slipped loose. and the world was watching. In his Orlando home, Shaq sat quietly on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, eyes scanning the headlines. He wasn't smiling. Fame had always been a double-edged sword, something he'd learned to wield but never fully trusted. He knew how quickly public love could sour, how fast narratives could turn, how easily a black man in the spotlight could become a target, no matter how beloved. This wasn't about basking in the glow of attention. This was about making sure that when the noise settled, real change was left standing. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of decades, the times he'd been told to stay in his lane, to smile and endorse, not challenge. He thought about all the kids who looked up to him, all the young black entrepreneurs watching now, wondering if the fight was worth it. His chest tightened. He wasn't just fighting for Darius. He was fighting for the space Darius represented, the space black ambition deserved, but was constantly denied. Down the hall, Lucille and Shawnee spoke in hushed tones, watching the coverage. Lucille's eyes were sharp, reading between the lines of every statement the bank released, every carefully placed media leak. "They're scared," she murmured, "but they're not folding. They're circling." Shawnee nodded, her arms crossed, worry lining her face. "They'll try to spin this, make Shaq the angry father, Darius the spoiled son. We've seen this playbook." Meanwhile, Darius sat in his apartment, phone buzzing non-stop, emails flooding in, interview requests piling up. He should have felt triumphant, but instead, unease gnawed at his gut. Something wasn't sitting right. Corey, his closest friend, had sent a warning. "Bro, check your inbox, somebody's leaking stuff, internal stuff about you. They're saying you don't have the experience, that your business is shaky, that you were just riding your dad's coattails." Darius scrolled through the emails, heart pounding. Anonymous tips, planted stories, insider whispers, all painting him as an unqualified figurehead. He clenched his fists. Who was feeding the bank this garbage? Someone close. Someone with access. He thought about his meetings, his calls, his partnerships. His mind raced through possibilities, the tension twisting tighter. At the same time, Shaq's assistant Jenna knocked gently on the door. "Shaq, you need to see this." She handed over a tablet, the screen filled with compiled reports. "They're trying to discredit Darius. Leaked emails, planted doubts. We traced some of it, and it's coming from inside your extended network." Shaq's brow furrowed, his jaw setting hard. He could take the blows aimed at himself. He'd been weathering public attacks for decades. But seeing them target his son, undercut his hard-earned progress, stirred a different fury. He stood, shoulders squared, voice low, "Find out who's behind it." Quietly. Outside, reporters clustered at the bank's doors, cameras flashing as executives gave rehearsed statements. But the narrative had already slipped from their control. Protesters began gathering, holding signs that read, "Money talks, but so do we, and let us in the room." Across social platforms, people dug up the bank's past controversies, sharing them under trending hashtags. The pressure was mounting, and everyone knew it. Darius, pacing his apartment, finally called his father. His voice was tight, controlled. "Dad, we need to talk. Somebody's feeding the bank lies about me. They're trying to crush this before it even starts." Shaq's voice came through the line, calm but edged with steel. "I know. I'm on it. But listen, son, this is where you show them who you are, not just who your father is. You ready for that?" Darius drew a shaky breath, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "Yeah, I'm ready, but I'm not letting you carry this alone." Shaq let out a small, proud chuckle. "Good. Because this is bigger than both of us now." As the sun dipped below the city skyline, the O'Neals braced for the next phase of the fight. The world was watching. But behind the headlines, behind the noise, something darker was moving. A betrayal waiting to surface. A test neither father nor son saw coming yet. Darius paced his apartment, eyes darting across his phone screen, piecing together messages, news alerts, and warnings from Corey. His chest tightened as the puzzle started to form. The leaked details, the planted stories, the subtle sabotage aimed not at his father, but directly at him. Only someone close could have fed the bank those details. His stomach twisted as one name floated to the surface, a name he didn't want to believe, Trent O'Neal. Trent had been more like an older brother than a cousin. Growing up, they'd played ball in the driveway, traded sneakers, shared dreams about building a black-led business empire together. Trent had always been hungry, always hustling, always trying to make a name for himself. But over the last year, Darius had sensed a shift. Trent growing distant, frustrated, impatient. Now the whispers aligned. It wasn't a random leak. It was Trent. Heart pounding. Darius called his father. Shaq answered on the second ring, his voice heavy. "D, I was just about to call you." Jenna traced the source. Darius's voice was tight. "It's Trent, isn't it?" Shaq exhaled slowly, the weight of a man who had seen too many betrayals in his life. "Yeah, son. It's Trent." Silence hung between them, thick and painful. Darius pressed his palm to his forehead, eyes squeezing shut. "Why, Dad? Why would he do this?" Shaq sat in his study, eyes fixed on a framed family photo. They promised him a position, D. Executive seat. Influence. He saw his chance to get in through the back door, and he took it. His voice softened. "Sometimes the hardest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones sitting at your own table." Darius felt his throat tighten, the ache pressing hard against his chest. "I trusted him." "I know." Shaq's voice was quiet but steady. "We both did." Meanwhile, across town, Trent sat in a sleek midtown bar, his face tense as he watched the news crawl across the TV screen. The bank had promised him a shot, a seat at the table if he could feed them inside intel to discredit Darius. He'd convinced himself it wasn't personal, just business, just survival. But now, watching the headlines twist, seeing his own cousin framed as unqualified, a sharp pang of guilt gnawed at his gut. Back in Orlando, Shaq's massive hand drummed slowly against the table, his mind flashing back to his own hard lessons. Fame, money, power. They didn't shield you from betrayal. If anything, they attracted it. He'd always tried to shield Darius from the darker side of ambition, but some lessons, he realized, had to be lived. "Dad, what do we do now?" Darius's voice was strained, teetering between anger and heartbreak. Shaq leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "We stay focused. We don't let this crack us. You've got a meeting with Crestmont coming up. You walk in there with your head high. Let me handle Trent." Darius hesitated. "You're gonna talk to him?" "Yeah," Shaq murmured, his jaw tightening. "I'm gonna remind him who raised him, who lifted him, who gave him a seat before anyone else ever offered." That evening, Shaq made the call. Trent answered on the first ring, his voice rushed, anxious. "Oh my God, I know what you're gonna say." Shaq's tone was low and deliberate. Do you know what it feels like to look at your own family and realize they're the ones swinging the knife?" Trent's voice cracked slightly. "I didn't mean to hurt Darius. I wanted my shot, and I've been grinding for years. They offered me something big, and..." Shaq cut in, voice steady but edged. "You think this world gives us clean shots, Trent? You think we get to sell each other out, and still stand tall at the end?" He paused, his breath heavy. "I pulled you into rooms, gave you opportunities, trusted you, and you sold your own blood for a chair at their table." On the other end, Trent fell silent. Shaq's voice softened slightly, but it carried a deep, weary weight. "I'm not gonna crush you, Trent, but I am pulling you back. You step away now. You don't speak for this family, and you sure as hell don't stand next to Darius in that boardroom." Trent whispered, "I'm sorry, Aunt. I just wanted to be someone." Shaq closed his eyes briefly, the ache pulsing through his chest. "You could have been, Trent, but you forgot who you were fighting for." As the call ended, Shaq sat quietly for a long moment, the edges of his strength fraying slightly. He had weathered betrayals in the public eye, but this one cut deeper, not just because of Trent, but because of what it revealed: the fragility of black ambition in a world that offered narrow ladders and sharp cliffs. Later that night, Shaq called Darius again. "Trent's out," he said quietly. "We're tighter now, D. No more leaks. But this next part, it's all you." Darius sat at his desk staring out at the city skyline, feeling the heaviness in his chest slowly transform. The betrayal still stung, but beneath it something sharper ignited resolve. He had been fighting for his own name, but now he realized he was fighting for every person watching, every family counting on this win, every door that needed to be kicked open. As father and son braced for the next day's confrontation, the weight of the betrayal hung in the air, but so did something else: the fierce determination to prove that no inside crack, no outside attack, could break the foundation they'd built. The knock at Darius's door was light, hesitant, but it jolted him from his restless pacing. He opened it cautiously, and there stood Jordan West, sharp-eyed, purposeful, her shoulders squared, despite the obvious tension in her face. Darius blinked, caught off guard. He knew her name from the leaks, from whispers his father's team had uncovered, but he hadn't expected her to show up in person. "I'm Jordan West," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "Compliance officer, technically still with Crestmont. But not for long, I imagine." She handed him a slim folder. "You need to see this." Inside, pages of damning documentation waited. Internal memos, rejection patterns, coded language in meeting minutes, email threads where board members laughed off Darius's proposal as a publicity stunt. Darius's jaw tightened as he flipped through, the full weight of institutional bias laid bare on the page. "Why are you bringing this to me?" he asked cautiously, eyes narrowing. Jordan exhaled sharply, her voice low. "Because I've been sitting inside that machine for 3 years, watching them crush every black applicant who walks through the door. I tried to fight from the inside. I hit a wall, but you've got something I don't, a platform." Darius felt the anger rise in his chest. Not at her, but at the system she was describing. A system he had already felt slam against him, but now saw in brutal documented detail. For a long moment, he just stood there, trying to absorb the scale of what she'd risked bringing to his door. "Okay," he said quietly, motioning her inside. "Let's talk strategy." Meanwhile, back in Orlando, Shaq sat alone in his office, watching footage of the media frenzy unfolding. He had done his part, the heavy push, the door kicking, but now the stage was shifting. Darius needed to step forward, not as Shaq's son, but as a leader. Shaq's massive hands folded together, his heart both heavy and proud. He knew how hard it was to let go, to let your child take the reins, but this was the moment. He had prepared Darius for this, and now it was time to step slightly back. Darius and Jordan, huddled over laptops late into the night, mapping out a daring high-stakes plan. "We're not just buying shares," Jordan explained, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We're rallying the shareholders against the board. Public pressure plus documented evidence equals forced leadership change." Darius rubbed his temples, feeling the weight settle on his shoulders. "We can actually do this." She gave a tight, grim smile. "We can, if you're ready to stand up and take the hits they'll throw at you." Across the room, Corey paced on a video call. This is insane, but it's also brilliant. You're not just getting a seat at the table, you're flipping the table over." Darius let out a shaky laugh. "Guess we better make sure we stick the landing." By morning, the news was out. Darius O'Neal was assembling a coalition of minority shareholders, using the media firestorm to push for an emergency vote on board leadership. The bank's executives scrambled, trying to get ahead of the narrative. But the momentum was shifting fast. Calls poured in from national civil rights groups, influential investors, even celebrity allies, all throwing their weight behind Darius's push. Shaq watched it unfold from the sidelines, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Lucille sat beside him, her hand resting on his massive forearm. "He's stepping into himself, Shaq, she murmured. "Let him shine." Shaq's voice was soft. "He's ready, Mama." In New York, Darius suited up for the biggest meeting of his life. As he stood before the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, his phone buzzed. It was his father. Shaq's voice rumbled through the line, steady and warm. "Whatever happens in there, you walk out with your head high. You hear me? This isn't just about today. This is about every day after." Darius swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat. "I hear you, Dad. Thanks." Outside the bank, media vans lined the street, cameras rolling, as Darius strode through the front doors, flanked by Jordan and a team of sharp legal advisors. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, the boardroom charged with a nervous energy. Gregory Phelps sat at the head of the table, his expression tight, forced calm barely masking the tension underneath. "Mr. O'Neal," Gregory began smoothly, "we're surprised to see you under these circumstances." Darius smiled slightly, his voice clear. "I doubt you're surprised, Mr. Phelps. You just didn't expect me to come prepared." As he laid out the evidence, the shareholder coalition's demands, and the call for a leadership vote, the room shifted. Old alliances frayed. Nervous glances darted between board members. Gregory's mask cracked slightly, a flicker of panic surfacing. Jordan's voice cut through sharply. "You've run this institution on exclusion and bias long enough. Change is here, whether you're ready or not." For the first time, Darius felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was leading. And Shaq, watching from miles away, felt a surge of fierce, quiet pride. His son was no longer standing in his shadow. He was casting his own. The boardroom fell into a hush as Darius O'Neal stepped through the tall double doors, the heavy glass clicking softly behind him. He wore a sharp gray suit, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted just enough to send a message. This was not the boy they laughed at last time. Flanking him were Jordan West, her face set with razor-sharp determination, and two sharp-suited legal advisors, who moved with the quiet confidence of people carrying loaded weapons. Legal, not literal. Behind them, a wave of shareholders followed, their presence a silent but undeniable force. Outside the building, reporters pressed against barricades, cameras flashing, mics thrust forward as the story of the year unfolded. Shaquille O'Neal watched from a private office miles away, his massive frame perched at the edge of his seat, Lucille's steady hand resting on his forearm. He wasn't in the room, but his influence, his name, and his relentless push had set the stage for this moment. Now, it was Darius's time to step into the spotlight, alone. Gregory Phelps, the chairman, sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the advisors murmuring in his ear. Sarah Whitmore, the CFO, kept her arms folded tightly, her smile a thin, sharp line. They had underestimated Darius once. Today they were praying they hadn't made a fatal miscalculation. Darius set his documents carefully on the table, his voice calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we've called this emergency session under the rights afforded to minority shareholders. We are here to present evidence, review governance failures, and propose an immediate leadership vote. Gregory gave a brittle laugh. Mr. O'Neal, you must understand, these things are handled through formal channels, not media spectacle. Darius's eyes locked onto his. You dismissed me before. You laughed me out of this room. Now I'm here by the book, and the media's watching because you made sure the world saw who you really are. The room tensed as Jordan stepped forward, laying down the documented evidence. Discriminatory lending practices, internal bias patterns, a culture of exclusion that had been swept under the rug for years. The board members exchanged tight glances, their careful poker faces starting to crack. And then, just as Darius began outlining the proposal for a leadership change, the door creaked open again. Heads turned sharply. Trent O'Neal stepped in.
The room froze.
Darius's chest tightened. He hadn't seen Trent since the betrayal surfaced. His cousin's face was pale, his hands slightly shaking, but his eyes met Darius's with something close to apology. Trent took a deep breath, his voice carrying across the room. I'm here to back the motion. A ripple of shock ran through the board. Gregory's face twisted. Trent, this isn't your place. Trent squared his shoulders, his voice gaining strength. You promised me a seat if I undercut my own family. I did, and I regretted it the second I saw how far Darius was willing to go, not just for himself, but for everyone you've pushed aside. I stand with him now. Darius's throat tightened, emotion surging unexpectedly, but he forced himself to stay focused. Thank you, Trent. Shaq, watching remotely, let out a slow breath, pride softening his eyes. Lucille smiled faintly beside him. Blood remembers. Shaq, she murmured, even when it stumbles. Back in the boardroom, Darius laid out the final demand, the resignation of Gregory and Sarah, immediate restructuring, and an oversight committee led by a diverse coalition of stakeholders. Gregory blustered, threatening lawsuits, market backlash, public fallout, but his voice grew weaker with each sentence, drowned out by the steady wall of evidence, legal backing, and the now united shareholder front. Darius's final words silenced the room. This isn't just about me. This is about every black entrepreneur you laughed at, every minority investor you dismissed, every community you profited from while locking us out. Today, we break that pattern. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then slowly, deliberately, one of the elder board members cleared his throat. I support the motion. Another followed, and another. Gregory's face crumbled as the realization sank in. The room had turned. The leadership vote passed, and with it the old guard began to fall. Outside, reporters swarmed as news of the board's collapse broke live. Darius emerged, standing tall, flashes snapping around him, but his gaze was steady, focused, no longer seeking validation. He had walked in as Shaq's son. He walked out as Darius O'Neal, a man who had stood his ground and reshaped the room. Back home, Shaq smiled softly, his massive shoulders relaxing. He didn't need to say anything. Lucille squeezed his hand gently. Shawnee, watching from the side, nodded with quiet satisfaction. The family had taken the hits, the betrayals, the doubts, and they had come through together. As the sun dipped low over the city, Darius stood on the building steps, Jordan and Trent beside him. The battle wasn't over. There would be more negotiations, more resistance, more work ahead. But today, the system had been cracked open, and he was no longer waiting for permission to walk through. The sunlight poured through the tall windows of the boardroom, casting long streaks of gold across the polished table. Darius stood at the head of the room, flanked by new leadership, faces that reflected the diversity and energy the bank had long kept at arm's length. He was no longer the young man pitching alone, fighting to be taken seriously. Now he stood surrounded by people who saw him as a leader, not just a name. At the back of the room, quietly observing, stood Shaquille O'Neal. He had intentionally kept to the shadows today, content to watch rather than direct. His massive frame leaned lightly against the door frame, arms folded, a soft, thoughtful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had fought many battles in his life, on the court, in business, in the public eye, but none had been as personal, as intimate, as the one he'd just watched his son win. Lucille O'Neal sat near the window, her proud eyes following every word Darius spoke. She exchanged a quiet look with Shaq, and in that silent glance passed a lifetime of meaning. They had raised him for this moment, when he would step beyond their protection and claim his own space. Shawnee too stood to the side, arms crossed, her face equal parts fierce and tender. She knew what this cost Darius, what it meant for him to carry the weight not just of business ambition, but of generations-long struggle. As the final motions were signed, and the board reshuffled, Darius turned briefly, his eyes finding his father across the room. For a split second, a quiet exchange passed between them. No words, just the shared understanding between two men who had fought hard in their own ways to reach this moment. Darius gave a subtle nod. Shaq in return smiled and tapped his chest softly with one hand before slipping out of the room, leaving the spotlight fully on his son. Outside, the world watched with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Reporters packed the sidewalks, protest signs waved proudly, and social media feeds buzzed with clips of the O'Neals breaking through the old, crumbling barriers of corporate power. But beyond the cameras, beyond the hashtags, the real shift was quieter, deeper, a recalibration of what it meant for Black ambition to stand uncompromised, unapologetic, and unstoppable. That evening, Shaq sat on the back patio of his Orlando home, the Florida night warm around him. A glass of iced tea rested on the table, condensation sliding down the sides. He gazed up at the sky, stars just beginning to blink into view. He thought about his own journey, the towering highs, the brutal setbacks, the lessons learned in sweat and sacrifice. But mostly he thought about the future, about the world his children would continue to shape long after his own footsteps faded from the headlines. Darius joined him quietly, sitting in the chair beside him. For a moment neither spoke, just letting the night settle between them. Finally, Darius let out a long breath. "I thought I wanted to do it all without you." Shaq chuckled softly, his deep voice warm. "I know, and you did, D. You did it your way." Darius shook his head. "I couldn't have done it without you standing behind me." Shaq turned, his eyes kind but serious. "You didn't need me to push you, you just needed to know I was there, if you fell. That's what family does." They sat in silence for a while, the crickets filling the space with their quiet song. Lucille and Shawnee joined them after a while, carrying plates of late-night snacks, the mood easy, light, but beneath it all, charged with the unspoken weight of everything they'd weathered. "This isn't the end," Lucille said softly, her wise eyes sweeping over them all. "This is just the beginning. What you boys did, you cracked open something bigger than one bank, one fight. People are watching now, learning, seeing what's possible." Shawnee added, her voice firm, "They'll come harder next time, but now you know how to stand together." Darius leaned back, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "Yeah, together." In the days that followed, the O'Neal name became more than just a celebrity brand. It became a symbol of pushing back, of refusing to accept the quiet, polite barriers that had been placed in front of Black enterprise for generations. Darius led the charge, working with new partners, community leaders, and rising Black entrepreneurs to create pathways that hadn't existed before. Jordan West became a key figure in reshaping internal policies, holding the new leadership accountable, ensuring the momentum wasn't lost in the face of public attention fading. Shaq remained present but deliberately stepped back from the front lines, understanding that his greatest victory wasn't in the battles he fought himself, but in the ground he helped clear for his children to run. He spent more time with Lucille, more time reflecting, more time offering quiet counsel rather than loud direction. One afternoon, as Darius prepared for yet another major meeting, he paused by a framed photo of himself as a child, perched on his father's broad shoulders. For a moment, he touched the glass, feeling the years collapse into a single bittersweet second. He smiled softly, then straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and walked out the door, not as a man chasing his father's shadow, but as a man carrying his own name forward. In the end, the legacy wasn't about domination or headlines or money. It was about something quieter, deeper, a father's unwavering belief in his son, a son's relentless drive to honor that belief, and a family's shared commitment to breaking barriers, not just for themselves but for every voice that had been told to wait, to sit, to stay small. As the night deepened, Shaq stood quietly on his patio, gazing up at the stars, a soft, satisfied smile touching his lips. The fight wasn't over, it never really would be, but the baton had been passed, and in that moment, with the world turning quietly around him, Shaquille O'Neal understood that the truest power wasn't in holding the spotlight. It was in knowing when to let it shine on someone else. If this story shook something in you, don't just walk away. Ask yourself, where are your walls, and who's waiting for you to help break them? Every system changes when enough of us refuse to play by its old rules. Be the voice in the room, the ally in the fight, the spark that forces the world to take notice. Because legacy isn't given, it's built, one bold move at a time.